Another dilemma that we run into in almost all of new product development is something that sounds really trivial on the surface and almost never is. And that's the question of who's the customer? And I've always observed that if you're dealing in consumer packaged goods, things you find in the supermarket or the drugstore, it's usually pretty straightforward. There's usually a person that buys the stuff, and there might be a different person in the household who consumes the stuff. But if you're in the business of cornflakes, you've got it pretty easy. Unfortunately, most of the products that we deal with today have very complex, multi-layered sets of customers, and they're all important to please. They all play some role, and they all need to be satisfied in some way for you to have a really successful product. Something that I've always felt a great impatience with are companies that tend to concentrate on only one end of the continuum or the other. They only deal with their direct customer, or they only talk about the end user. And I find that usually everybody in that continuum is pretty important here. So for instance, I've dealt with financial services firms who only want to deal with their brokers who sell their products, and others who only want to talk to the end user who ultimately buys that. But there are all these other people in the middle there. We do a lot of work in medical devices, and a lesson we learned early on is that the end user of a device might be a nurse, but the decision could be a very complex network of the nurses, the physicians, the laboratory people, the technicians who have to fix the stuff when it breaks, not to mention the purchasing manager, who always plays a critical role. And what we learned, I think, through experience is that you really got to talk to all of these people, sometimes with one exception. I found that in hospitals, the purchasing manager often has no idea what it is they're buying. They've simply been directed by the clinicians, this is the product we want to get, and their only job is to squeeze you just as hard as they can on the price and the terms. But so far as useful information to develop a better blank, I found very often they're not all that useful. Then again, there are other industries, a lot of industrial products I deal in, where the purchasing people are extremely knowledgeable about what they're purchasing and are absolutely critical to a good voice of the customer study. So this question of who's the customer is always less trivial than it would seem on the surface. Another great surprise I had in medical devices was the role of these technicians who have absolutely no decision-making authority whatsoever. But what we found is that they can be real deal killers, because if they go to the decision makers and say, we really ought to avoid brand X because we've had terrible problems with them, they break all the time, they're hard to repair, have a hard time getting parts, effectively, brand X is probably out of the game right from the start there. So really, all of these people will play a role. And if you're trying to do any kind of new product development, market research, or a voice of the customer study, I think they're all relevant customers to talk to.